Jim and Betty just got engaged. How exciting! They have been together for 6 months and are deeply in love. Every time they see each other, they are filled with joy. They both like country music, scuba diving, and hiking. They're both Roman Catholic and get along with each other's family. Jim's friends love Betty, and Betty's friends love Jim. In other words, they are a perfect couple. They have a lovely summer wedding and buy a house in a metropolitan area. Neither of them want to have kids just yet, so they enjoy their relaxed married life for a year or so. But slowly, Betty realizes that something is wrong. She doesn't feel the same way about Jim as she used to, and the relationship is not as young and exciting anymore. She at first does not accept this, and tries to initiate conversation with Jim when he comes home from work, hoping that they will fall back into their patterns of infatuation. However, Jim's job is very stressful, so when Betty tries to talk to him, he generally is in a negative state of mind and responds coldly, sometimes with anger or lashing out. Betty takes this personally, and instead of risking conflict by trying to communicate with him, she stops trying to start these conversations. The less that they talk, the more tense the relationship becomes. Soon, even a simple conversation, such as deciding where to go for dinner, becomes a canvas for them to be passive-aggressive towards each other, or straight up argue in futile attempts to express their anger. Eventually, they feel they no longer even know each other. Roughly 4.5 years after their initial wedding date, Betty comes home to find divorce papers sitting on the kitchen table. What happened? Where did they go wrong? A possible explanation is that they weren't right for each other. They didn't have enough in common, or they weren't soulmates, or whatever. But the problem isn't on the level of how well they fit together, but on an individual level. Studies show that people who fail at marriage fail over and over again. This is because they don't have the skill set necessary for a successful marriage, just like Jim and Betty. So what exactly drove them away from each other? The problem started with the fact that they got married so early. The first phase of the relationship, where both parties are infatuated and romantically falling in love with each other before developing long-term commitment, can last about 2 years. So when Betty and Jim committed to each other forever, the relationship was still held together with glee and lust. When Betty starts to feel differently about Jim, she perceives this as an issue in her marriage, when really her brain is just shifting into the next stage of the relationship. Jim made the next mistake, where the stress of his job caused him to act coldly toward Betty. An emotionally practiced person would have some strategy to deal with this. For example, learning to leave work frustrations at work, or asking Betty to engage later in the day when he is less tense. But instead, he takes his anger out on her, which slowly ends up tearing apart the relationship. The way that Betty handled Jim's coldness was another large slip-up and what drove the relationship downhill. Most likely, Betty did not have good models for communication growing up in her household. If Betty had been confident in her communication abilities, she could have brought up her concerns with Jim and possibly come up with a strategy so that they could engage with each other when Jim is in a positive state of mind. Instead of doing this, she makes a false assumption that his responses have something to do with her, and lets this anger perpetuate and destroy their marriage. When conflicts like this build up and cannot be resolved peacefully, it is only a matter of time until the stress within a relationship snowballs and everything that they had slips through their fingertips. But it didn't have to be this way. For Successful Modern Marriages is here to inform you how to avoid situations like this, by having accurate expectations for marriage, by learning to deal with your emotions, and by knowing how to communicate your feelings and concerns effectively. By informing the world one person at a time, we can make every marriage last.